Is this actually what we want? Do we really want a prison population that has gone from 40 or so thousand to 85,000 and could potentially go up to 112,000? If we're going to make a substantial difference, then there's no getting away from this point. We have to look at those who are serving relatively long sentences.
Look at releasing them sooner.
Will have to be released sooner if we are serious about not exceeding capacity.
Looking at Donald Trump, would you call him still the leader of the Western liberal world?
No, I don't think so. I think essentially his instincts are authoritarian. I don't think he is a believer in independent institutions, in a spreading and dispersal of power. I think his instincts are very authoritarian. I think he looks at Russia with a great deal of envy. It's a difficult time for what were the mainstream instincts.
This is the Lord Chancellors, where politics meets justice. Brought to you by the University of Law. David Gauke is one of the most notable Conservative politicians of the last decade. He was an MP for 14 years, held several ministerial positions and served as Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice for just over a year, from 2018 to 2019. He resigned from that post in protest against Boris Johnson's approach to Brexit, and later had the Conservative whip withdrawn after voting to block a no-deal Brexit. Gauke, who had been Conservative MP for South West Hertfordshire, then stood as an independent in the 2019 general election, but was unsuccessful.
So hearing that Herts South West, David Gauke, that's gone Conservative. David Gauke was standing there as an independent.
Last year, he rejoined the Conservative Party. He went to Northgate High School, Ipswich, and read law at St Edmund Hall, Oxford, then going on to qualify as a solicitor. He practiced for 6 years until entering Parliament in 2005. Gauke was recently appointed by the Labour government to head a major review of sentencing policy, exploring how the justice system can balance punishment and rehabilitation. I began by asking him how much the climate of politics had changed since he was in office, both on the world and domestic fronts.
It's extraordinary change over the course of 5 years. I felt my time in office was pretty turbulent, and what has happened since has seemed to have accelerated matters. I was there during the Brexit stalemate. You had Jeremy Corbyn leading the Labour Party, Theresa May as our Prime Minister, and of course we've had several Prime Ministers since then. We've had a complete transformation in terms of the sort of political balance. My old party, the Conservative Party, is in the weakest position it has probably been in its history. We've seen the emergence of reform internationally. We see as on the day that we're talking, the looks of the whole Western alliance is in significant peril.
Yes.
So yes, it's been an extraordinary time. I've obviously been on the outside for that. I do quite a lot of writing about politics. And
you do. You write for the New Statesman, don't you?
I write for the New Statesman and also Conservative Home, so which is an interesting combination. So
that's a good combination. Well, I mean, just taking the world stage, yes, things have very much shifted to the right, haven't they? I would say your politics, the politics where you are, in the centre of the Conservative Party, centre-right. You edited a book of essays on that title. Things have gone very far to the right. Looking at Donald Trump, would you call him still the leader of the Western liberal world? Does he deserve that title?
No, I don't think so. I don't think leader of the free world. I think he's. I'm conscious that, of course, what he says one day can be withdrawn and replaced another day. But I think essentially his instincts are authoritarian. I don't think he is a believer in independent institutions, in a spreading and dispersal of power. I think his instincts are very authoritarian. I think he looks at Russia with a great deal of envy. rather than repulsion. And so, no, his politics are very different. And you're right, Francis, the rise of the populist right, to some extent at the expense of the traditional centre-right, but also the traditional centre-left faces many challenges around the world.
Absolutely.
It's a difficult time for what were the mainstream instincts. And as you rightly allude to, a year or so ago, I edited a book, The Case for the Centre-Right, making the argument, if you like, that what was mainstream politics was almost disappeared, in the sense that there's little space for mainstream centre-right policies and parties in the way that there once was a sort of the dominant form of politics in this country. And it has become somewhat marginalised. I hope it will return, because I think those policies are right for the country.
You have been appointed very recently to lead an independent review of sentencing, appointed by the Labour government, of course. Is that a surprise to you that you've been appointed by not even your own party?
Well, I wasn't expecting the phone call, but I was delighted to be asked to do it. I say delighted, it's a challenging issue, and in the end we will come forward with recommendations about ways in which we can, at the very least, control the growth of the prison population over the next few years, because we have run out of space. But there's no getting away from the fact that almost any proposals that we make in this area that are effective in terms of controlling the prison population will have opposition. They will be controversial, they will be difficult, but nonetheless it is necessary. But no, I was grateful to get the phone call. So James Timpson, who I know quite well, we were fellow trustees of the Prison Reform Trust, phoned me up and asked me to be engaged. And as it happened, Shabana Mahmood was once my Treasury shadow when I was the Minister for Tax.
Oh, right. So this is how it came about.
Well, I perhaps, I'm never entirely
Yes.
clear.
And perhaps also to bring in, to make sure that what you do propose has the widest possible acceptance, do you think?
Yes, I'm sure.
Cross-party allegiance.
I'm sure that's right. I'm sure it is helpful to have a
Yes.
Conservative voice make the case for reform in this area and why it is necessary. And there will be plenty of other Conservatives, I hope, who will support the proposals. Whether the Conservative front bench does, I somewhat question. Early signs are not all that encouraging. But I think whoever is in government does have to wrestle with this. And we touched briefly on the international situation, but when some quite tough decisions are going to have to be made with the public finances, running a prison population that is more than twice the size of what it was during the 1980s, at a time when we were spending serious money on defence, is the sort of thing that we have to look at. Because
Yes.
I seriously believe that you can spend money in a much more effective way to reduce crime and provide value for money for the taxpayer.
Yes. Well, you've produced an interim report, and when is the main report out?
So the main report will come out in May.
Okay,
We
so
don't
not
have a
far
precise.
away.
So it's not far away. We've still got a lot of work to do to finalise our recommendations and reach conclusions. I'm fortunate to have an excellent panel made up of various experts bringing various knowledge and background skills to the task. But we'll come forward in May with those proposals.
Well, some of it's been trailed. I mean, could you just summarise perhaps a little your main findings and maybe the things that struck you or were most surprising to you that you found?
Well, what we've set out in the interim report is some facts that I think will be familiar to a lot of people, but we wanted to bring everything together in one document. And namely, that is, we have seen a very substantial increase in the prison population. We have got, per head of population, the largest prison population in Western Europe. That has principally been driven, that increase has been driven by a succession of governments coming forward with policies, very often, I think, knee-jerk, responding to high-profile cases to lengthen sentences. This then works its way through the system, and we end up with substantially longer sentences than we had 30 years ago, and a much bigger prison population. And what has driven the population increase is not people on short sentences. There's a lot of focus on short sentences for reasons I completely understand, but it is really driven by people who've committed serious offences, but they're getting much longer sentences than they had before.
And who do we blame for the longer sentences? I mean, is it statutory change that increases the framework? Is it judges sentencing at the top of their discretion? Who is to blame?
I would put the blame essentially on governments and parliaments. Yes, of course, judges will respond to that, but I think the point that judges tend to make is, well, of course they're going to respond to the decisions that are made by governments. Sometimes I think governments don't necessarily think through the implications. So, for example, when we saw increases in sentences for murder, that then will inevitably, I think, play through into, well, what about attempted murder? What about manslaughter? What about grievous bodily harm? And
Has a knockdown effect.
It has
Yes.
there's a ratchet effect. It drags everything else up with it. So although there is criticism, and the Sentencing Council, some will say, well, look, their guidelines have resulted in higher sentences, but that's largely reflecting what governments have done and Parliament has done.
You're not thinking, perhaps, having read your report, you're not thinking perhaps, let's get rid of the Sentencing Council. It's not helping. It's actually adding to sentence inflation.
No, we're certainly not thinking of that. I was going to say a little bit in defence of politicians, and I obviously was one. It is very hard to resist calls for longer sentences. There is a media environment, in particular, where there will be a focus on atypical cases. Naturally. And very often demands from victims' families, for example, for a longer sentence in a particular area. And no one could be critical of victims' families in those circumstances. You completely understand why that is the case. I've been in those meetings, and at a human level, let's put aside raw politics, and of course there's plenty of politics there as well. But just as a human level, you don't want to leave that meeting disappointing somebody. And I think politicians have been very quick to respond.
You're not blaming the media. You're saying it's more a response to the public.
Yes, I think
wish for heavier penalties.
Yeah, and that, I think, is an environment that has meant that at no point have we stepped back and taken a kind of coherent view as to what our sentencing should be.
Well, no government.
What is the size of the prison population we want? It's been a somewhat haphazard process, and I hope one of the things that we can do as a sentencing review is to provide that sense of perspective and say, is this actually what we want? Do we really want a prison population that has gone from 40 or so thousand to 85,000 and could potentially go up to 112,000.
Well, which government, and this one is included, and you alluded to it a few minutes ago, about not entirely having support maybe on the front bench, which government is going to be brave enough to say, right, we're going to reduce sentence lengths, we're going to have far more people kept out and non-custodial alternatives, beef up community sentences, as you probably will do. Which government is going to be brave enough to do that?
Well, I hope that we will come forward with recommendations that this government can feel able to implement. And there are certain factors that mean there is an opportunity today, the most important of which is the fact that the prisons are full and something has to be done. There's never a more powerful argument than there is no alternative. And truth be told, we cannot build the prison space quickly enough to meet the demand that we're likely to see over the next 2 or 3 years. Now, you can take a view over a longer period of time, but over the next 2 or 3 years, we will see, unless action is taken, similar scenes to what we saw in the autumn of governments having to bring in emergency release regimes
Did you support that?
The
release of thousands of prisoners early?
In truth be told, in the circumstances the government was in, they had no choice. I mean, they really did have no choice. And I know they've received a lot of criticism for it, but whoever had won the last general election was going to be forced to take those measures. But that is very far from ideal. You don't want to be rushing these measures. You don't want to be in a position where prisoners are getting and the prison system is getting a few weeks' notice to say, right, these offenders are going to be released on this date. You want it to be coherent, you want it to be strategic, you want it to be planned. And those are the circumstances that I think we've got to avoid. And the point of our one of the points of our review is to ensure that we are never in that position again. That to the extent that people are being released, they're going to be released, in a planned way when preparation can be made for their reintegration into society, and are not an ad hoc emergency measure. That is the wrong way to go about doing this. But if you're the government and you find yourself in the situation where there is no capacity, what else can you do? I mean, there are other countries that are currently looking at ideas of essentially having a waiting list before you go in prison. I don't think that's very attractive.
A waiting list before you start serving your sentence?
Before you start serving your sentence. And
what happens to you meanwhile?
Well, you're in the community in the interim.
I don't think that would go down very well.
Don't think it would.
You're not looking at that then?
Well, that's not the answer. We don't think that's the answer. Although, as I say, some countries are doing that.
You obviously, some of the things I think that have been trailed, house arrest, more house arrest, perhaps fewer women, perhaps letting out older prisoners. But I think that you said that you had evidence that would support people not being required in their dying days or the last days of their lives to stay in prison. Are these the sort of things you're looking at?
Those are the sort of things that we will look at. All of these proposals have got particular challenges, and I don't want to kind of second guess where
can you give us a little bit of can you give us perhaps just one or two things that you would definitely be looking at?
Very broadly, there are three ways in which you can control the prison population. One is about not sending people to prison at all, who might otherwise be dealt with in the community. The second is, if people are sent to prison, for them to be in prison for less long. And the third is about rehabilitation and about reducing the level of crime. Now, we will look at measures that assist all three of those objectives. So whether that is people who have maybe committed relatively minor offences and currently go to prison for a short period of time, is there something else that we can do there? That, I think, there's been a lot of talk about short sentences. I was very interested in this when I was Justice Secretary. And we're clearly going to look at that.
Do you mean getting rid of them entirely, or because that has been proposed, hasn't it?
Again, we'll come to the details when we set out our full review. There are absolutely cases. When I was looking at it, for example, breaches of conditions. Breaches of court orders. You
mean whether those people should always be called back?
I think,
there's recalls,
there's a lot of recalls, and we're certainly looking at recalls. But for example, if you breach an order, should you be able to go into prison for a short period of time? When I was Justice Secretary, I always accepted the point that there was a need for that.
Right.
So we'll look at it. But I think the point I would make about short sentences is it may well be an important part of what we need to do, because we know that the reoffending rate for those with short sentences is exceptionally high. So it's not helpful to the wider community. But it's not going to save vast numbers of prison places.
No. So what are the kind of big things that
So the bigger things. So this is where you get into the quite really challenging point
where those
about
women
those
should go,
who,
for example.
well, again, a lot of the women who I would argue don't need to be in prison, but they're largely there because, again, short sentences. So there's not masses of savings there either. where there are savings, or where if we're going to make a substantial difference, then there's no getting away from this point. We have to look at those who are serving relatively long sentences, and those
Look at releasing them sooner.
will have to be released sooner if we are serious about not exceeding capacity.
So not necessarily bringing down sentence lengths, or possibly that, maybe, I don't know what you're saying, or just is it releasing them after serving less time?
Well, again, we'll set out the.
But it could
the
be one
details.
of those two.
We'll look at
both.
all. Again, we'll set out the details.
I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can just
May.
you can divulge just a little bit of what you're going.
Well, look, we haven't reached our final conclusion, so
No.
I can't, Francis, tell you.
But anyway,
precisely
shorter
what they're going to
sentences
be.
probably.
But fundamentally, if we are going to keep control of our prison population, this isn't just going to be done on short sentences. And
No.
again, the only way you can address that is the very large number of people we've got in prison who are in there for a reasonable length of time,
Yeah.
and whether they need to spend all of that time behind bars in the way that they currently do.
Fine. Can I ask you two final questions on this topic, because it's obviously a big topic and one that you're right in the midst of. Community sentences, or just for want of a better word, doing things not in prison, serving time outside prison. The public don't have any confidence in those, really, do they? So how can you beef up public confidence in non-custodial sentences?
There is a real challenge about that. I completely accept it, and confidence has been diminished with judges and magistrates, and that has fed through into the decline in the use of community sentences. We are looking at that. We will come forward with proposals of ways in which we can make it work. I've talked earlier about ways in which we can spend money as effectively as we possibly can to reduce crime. I do think the probation system needs proper support.
By that you mean more money, do you?
Well, I think it does need to be able to. It does need to be funded to be able to deliver here, and I think more can be done to reduce crime by relatively small sums of support for the probation service than really quite large sums of money in expanding the prison population.
Right, which brings me to my second point. Your report is coming along just as we're massively going to boost our defence budget. And you, having spent 6 years, I think, at least, in the Treasury, didn't you, in one capacity or another, you know better than anybody how on earth the case will be made for more money, how difficult that will be. Anything you suggest that requires more money, it's just never going to happen, is it?
I think you're right to highlight the context in which we are operating, which has become more acute since this review began in October. The argument I would make here is that it is all the more important that we spend money as effectively as we possibly can. And if the objective is about reducing crime, and that is what I believe the objective should be, would we really go about doing it in the way that we currently do? And if you go over the course of a generation to essentially doubling your prison population, and you continue down that trend, that is consuming a huge amount of resources and has left other parts of the justice system and other parts of the system that can help reduce crime underinvested in. So I think there is an argument, I absolutely accept that this is going to be a tough time for government spending across the board, but all the more reason to spend that money wisely.
So it's going to be more about better use of resources than asking for more resources?
Well, I'm as you say, Francis, I'm an ex-Treasury Minister, so it's very easy for someone to come along with a review like this and say the answer is to spend loads of money, left, right, and centre. There are certain parts of the system that I think we could spend money on that would bring a really good return in terms of reducing additional costs. So, for example, I've talked couple of times quite publicly about having seen problem-solving courts operate. I've seen them in this country. I've been to the problem-solving court in Birmingham that's focused on women offenders.
They are expensive.
They are they're more expensive than the normal process, and they place demands on the rest of the system, if you like. They bring it together. But I've also seen it in Texas. Recently been there. But the returns, if you like, are really considerable.
So you'll be pressing the case for that kind of reform.
So I think we will certainly want to be looking at the use of problem-solving courts. And when we say expensive, in the context of a world in which it takes a very large sum of money to build a new prison place, and it takes a large sum of money to keep someone behind bars for 12 months, these problem-solving courts really are not very expensive.
Can I take you onto a completely different thing now? Let's talk a bit about your personal background and how and why you went into law. Did you have any lawyers in your family?
No, my father was a policeman, so he had quite a lot to do with courts and what have you. But no, I was.
What kind of policeman was he? Was he a Bobby on the beat? Was he?
He started as all police officers.
Did he do criminal investigations, or what did he do?
He ended up as a chief superintendent. He was particularly focused on police communications and worked for the Home Office the last few years of his career. But of course, all police officers start off as a Bobby on the beat, and he did a lot of criminal work as a young police officer. So I suppose there was a little bit of law there, but not really. Look, the honest answer is, so when I was at sixth form, the head of careers kind of sort of scouting around to see which of the pupils there were suitable to apply to Oxbridge. And all of my teachers said, David's definitely someone who should apply to Oxbridge, just not in my subject. So I had to sort of have a think about what was the subject that I wasn't actually being taught that I could apply for, and so
you thought about law.
I thought about
and
law.
That's what you went to read,
and that's what I went to read. So I was fortunate to get into Teddy Hall, and
very good. Yes.
So I read law there.
Right.
So that's really where it started. And
that's where it started. You then went on to qualify as a solicitor. You didn't fancy going to the bar?
I didn't, and I sometimes look back on that and think that I made a mistake. I think the bar would probably have suited me, that the skills necessary for the bar, at least some of them I may have had, and perhaps it's a more common route to go from the bar to politics, which is obviously ultimately what I did. But I didn't really give it sort of serious consideration. I think in part, being a solicitor was perhaps a more secure route. It was a way in which you could attract funding, take you through law school.
You came to Macfarlane's, which is where we're sitting now, and is that where you had your first job?
No, I trained at what was Richards Butler, now Reed Smith. So I qualified there, and I was there for about 18 months or so.
But you went directly into corporate law, did you? Or
financial services regulation.
Did you enjoy that?
To some extent. I mean, I left after 18 months, came to Macfarlane's, and I was here for 6 years, so quite a long stint. What
prompted you then to think, actually, this is not going to be my career. I'd like to go into politics. What prompted that?
I'd always been interested in politics. I'd always been fascinated by it. Immediately after I was at university, I spent a year as a parliamentary research assistant. Even when I was at law school, I found myself running as a candidate for the council elections in 1995, which was a particular low point for the Conservative Party, and I think in my particular seat I was the first ever Conservative candidate that finished third in what should have been a safe Tory seat. So I sort of had that experience. I got involved in local politics I was never a councillor, but I got involved in my local association in northwest London. And so that was always a sideline. It was a hobby.
Yeah.
And I fought the 2001 general election in Brent East, which was then a very safe Labour seat.
You didn't get that?
I didn't get that. It would have been a bit of a shock if I had. The intention was not to get it. But we moved out to Chorley Wood, southwest Hertfordshire, in 2002 when we were expecting our first child. I joined the local association there, and then the city MP announced he was going to retire.
So that was an obvious.
So that was an obvious
Yeah.
opportunity, and
Yes.
I was just really fortunate. I was the right person at the right time.
Yes.
I'd been I'd been a member of that association. I'd been there long enough to make some friends and not long enough to make any enemies. And I think they wanted someone who was a bit local and had local credentials. They were worried about the Lib Dems
Yes.
campaigning and taking the seat and so on. So because I had the local credentials and I had a few people on the selection committee, I got into the
You were the
final
candidate,
round
and you
I won.
got in.
Yeah, I got in.
And without going right through your parliamentary career, you've held various positions, and as we've mentioned, quite a few of them within the Treasury. And then at the end of that run, you were appointed to be Lord Chancellor / Justice Secretary.
Well, I had 7 months at DWP.
Oh, of course you did.
To out with
Before
working
that,
pensions
that's right.
in between.
That's right.
Yes.
So your job actually as Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary was quite short-lived, wasn't it?
Yeah, 18 months or so. You say short-lived, Francis. I think I was the longest serving. I was longer than my three predecessors, at least.
Well, there have been, there've been quite a few who've just been very, very short tenures, haven't there?
It's all relative.
Perhaps we could move on to your time as Lord Chancellor. What were the main things that you remember from that time? And I accept it was a short time.
So there was a fair amount going on. I suppose most prominently is that I was trying to pursue a bit of a shift in terms of prison policy. So I was keen to push forward, for example, the education and employment plan, trying to get more prisoners ready for working life afterwards. Having come from DWP, perhaps I was very focused.
Is that where you
on
first
that.
met Lord Timpson? In that capacity?
Yes, in that capacity as the Lord Chancellor, I first met James on that, and began the work in terms of sentencing reform, particularly looking at short sentences. There was a certain amount of trying to repair the relationship with the judiciary, which had been difficult. David Lidington, my immediate predecessor, had done a lot of great work on that. So
let's just recap for people. So that things had become very bad with the judiciary, mainly under Liz Truss, wasn't it? One of your predecessors.
that was where the relationship was at
Really
its
broke
most
down.
fraught. Yes,
Yes.
It did. There was the whole issue of the Daily Mail front page, enemies of the people, with pictures of
This
senior judges.
was when the judges made their ruling, which I think the Daily Mail and other papers took to be against, trying to perhaps block the government's policy of moving to Brexit.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
And
it
so
was the
they
Miller
were
One
very
case.
critical of the judiciary, and the criticism in turn was that by the judiciary was that Liz Truss should have spoken up
Yes.
for the judges and
Yes.
defend them,
Yes.
being unable to speak for themselves. Now, what view do you take about that? I think Liz Truss takes the view that it wasn't for her to tell newspapers what to write.
No, I disagree. And looking, almost one of the last things I did is in terms of the Lord Chancellor's speech to the judges in Mansion House, I made it explicitly clear that I think she should have intervened, that there was an attack on the judiciary there and the independence of the judiciary. And in my view, the role of the Lord Chancellor was to defend the judiciary in those circumstances. Liz was in a really difficult position. I don't think there was any enthusiasm from Number 10 for her to intervene. the Daily Mail at one level was trying to be helpful to the government, but I think it is important that the judiciary is respected, that on matters such as this, and look, it was this wasn't a, there's not a case where I think you could make any kind of argument that somehow the sort of judges had overstepped the mark or what have you. It was a perfectly decent, respectable decision, and the role of the government was to accept it. And I think that attack was completely unwarranted.
The attack was unwarranted. Did you think that you managed to, by the time you came along, that relations with the judges had been restored?
I hope I had and I think I did have a good relationship with the judiciary. I think they saw me as, by temperament, an ally, someone who understood.
Of course, you were a lawyer and the first solicitor.
It definitely helps. It definitely helps there. I think you get the benefit of the doubt if you come from a legal perspective. Having said that, it's not essential. I mean, I think the judiciary had a pretty high regard for David Lidington. Certainly had a high regard for David Lidington. Also Michael Gove. So I don't think on that specific point it's essential, but it definitely helps.
Did you have any particular matters of difficulty with them? Any dustings up or any rows behind the scenes?
No, I didn't. I mean, there will always be, if you like, some tensions in the sense of, judges will be wanting more resources. There are issues to do with courts maintenance and what have you, which I could completely understand. But there were particular issues, for example, on the situation with judges' pensions, where I hope I worked constructively with the judiciary, and having an understanding of how the Treasury thinks was helpful in the role that I had. So others for judge, but I think the relationship with the judiciary was much stronger at the point that I left it than it was when I arrived. But of course, after I left, there were some more challenging times when it came to issues of the rule of law that were to follow.
Recently, we had the Lady Chief Justice, Sue Carr, speaking out because ministers, namely the Prime Minister and actually Kemi Badenoch, had both criticised a judge over an immigration ruling. Did they do wrong? I mean, were they entitled to say what they said?
I think it is incumbent upon politicians to be very careful about what they say on individual cases when what is reported in the media isn't always completely accurate. I mean, obviously, Francis, in your time, the Times was exemplary.
Heaven forbid.
And I'm sure it still is. But I do think you've got to be really careful here, because sometimes something gets missed in the reporting, and and I think there were points about the reporting of that particular case, and a Palestinian family came in for a scheme that was designed for Ukrainians and so on, and it turned out that it was a little bit more complicated than that. And so I don't want to get too drawn into that case.
But on the other hand,
but that's an example where I think politicians have to be really careful, and why the Lord Chief Justice has to be prepared to defend.
Do you think Sue Carr, Lady Carr, was right to criticise the Prime Minister?
Well, look, I think where there is criticism of the judiciary, the Lord Chief Justice is, and I'm not au fait with all the details of the particular case, but where there's some inaccuracy, then I think she's entitled to intervene. I am also conscious that Prime Minister's questions is a bear pit, and nuance and subtlety are very hard to convey.
They're going to, absolutely. And I think also there is a view, and I most recently heard Lord Sumption, Jonathan Sumption, expressing this point, that if ministers actually are perfectly entitled as anybody else to say that they think a decision is wrong. I take your point, it might not have been exactly as it appeared, but let's say it was as it appeared. do they not have a right to say, we think that decision was wrong and we're going to do
Well,
something
look, I think
about it?
if there's a case of, look, there are 2 points to make here. One, if politicians think the law is wrong, they're absolutely entitled to say the law should be changed. The second case, the second point is if they think a judgment has been wrong, then ministers are entitled to say we disagree and are appealing. So that is a perfectly reasonable point. I think that there's a slight question in this case as to whether if they think that judgment is wrong, are they appealing? And again, as I say,
I think they are.
I think but I think yes. So if I think they're okay to say, well, I think it's absolutely fine to say we disagree and we are appealing.
It's a difficult area. All I'm just really saying is, it's not clear cut when the Lady Chief Justice or Lord Chief Justice, whoever it is, should be criticising ministers and vice versa, ministers, judges. It's difficult.
The point I'm making is I think politicians are best being careful criticising judges on a case like this if they're not entirely confident they know what all the facts
Know the
are.
facts. Fair enough.
And it's very easy to get drawn into a debate when the facts have not necessarily been properly conveyed.
It's 20 years since the Lord Chief Justice became the head of the judiciary. The Lord Chancellor had a different role and didn't have to act for the judges in the way they used to. Do you think that role works now as it is? Does it need any changes?
I think this is a difficult one because I don't think you can kind of go back to where we were. It was always the case that the Lord Chancellor position was a bit of an anomaly. Once you changed it, there was no going back. Now, could you have carried on with it as it was? Perhaps you could, but it was one of those that perhaps worked in practice, but it was impossible to justify in theory. One person who was both a member of the cabinet and head of the judiciary and sitting in the House of Lords. But once you've changed it, I don't think there's a perfect answer. And there's a long debate about, is it right that you have prisons alongside the kind of courts and judiciary role about this? My argument has always been that if you just have the courts and judiciary role in itself, on its own, for a cabinet minister, it becomes quite a thin role that you don't necessarily, it's not a place that you will get.
You don't have the whole picture.
You don't have the whole picture, but also you're just not in a very powerful position around the cabinet table.
Right.
Unless, so in the past, you were head of the judiciary, you were essentially Speaker of the House of Lords.
And you're saying without
you had a lot of status. If you take that away and just leave a minister that sort of is somewhere, sort of, is the government's representative working with the Lord Chief Justice on the courts process,
in charge, perhaps, of constitutional
Well,
matters.
that's the other thing, is that you could, the other model is that you throw in constitutional reform alongside it.
Yeah, well, what about that?
And I don't dismiss it, but we shouldn't think that is going to keep the Lord Chancellor away from party politics very much, and potentially could make them almost more party political, because you're then getting into issues of, when it comes to sort of parliamentary boundaries, or House of Lords reform, or electoral reform,
Quite, yes.
Or dealing with the devolved administrations. You're not going back to the role of a Lord Chancellor who is slightly above it.
No,
and I just don't think there's. I just don't
not going to be. It's got to be.
It's not going to be.
Position.
So I just don't think there is quite a perfect solution to this.
Just finally on that, the constitutional changes. What about? And a couple of people have mentioned this to me. The judges still actually have quite a say in the running of the courts, don't they? There's a strange kind of hybrid setup with the court service. Judges are represented on it. They have a role. Ministers have a role. Some people think perhaps judges should not be involved with that side of it at all. They should just deal with listing and sitting on their cases, obviously. But as for the admin of the courts, they shouldn't be bothered with it. What do you think?
No, I think you've got to have the judiciary role involved in this process. They're much closer to it. That the Lord Chief Justice is well placed to play a significant role in this. The current setup does depend upon a good working relationship between the Lord Chancellor and the Lord Chief Justice. I was very fortunate in my time working with Ian Burnett. We're working again together in the context of the Independent Sentencing Review, but we had a good practical relationship. I think we both respected each other where we were coming from. We were both able to speak candidly to each other. It wasn't a cozy relationship in that sense, but it was always a friendly and constructive
But if he
one.
had a concern, you could bring it to him.
Oh yes, yeah. He could bring concerns to me. I could bring concerns to him, and it worked. But it does require the right people in place to make that work.
Can I ask you, David, now a bit about your own resignation, how that came about, and your dealings with Boris Johnson?
Yes. Well, look, we go back to summer 2019. Theresa May resigns. Boris Johnson runs for the leadership of the Conservative Party. It was always likely that he was going to win. He set out a very clear policy, which is that we are going to leave on the 31st of October, come hell or high water. And even if that means leaving without a deal, and anyone who's going to be a member of my government will have to sign up to that. That wasn't something I could sign up to. I didn't think that was in any way going to be in the national interest. And given that that was my position, I had made no secret of the fact that I wasn't going to serve under Boris Johnson. To be fair, I don't think there was any sign that Boris Johnson would want me to serve. We didn't really have that conversation.
He wanted people around him.
He
who
wanted
supported
people around
him,
him who
obviously.
supported it, and he's perfectly entitled. He was perfectly entitled to want people to support. That was, he was elected on that policy. He won the Conservative leadership on that policy. I think it was a grave mistake, but he was perfectly entitled to do that. So, one of the last things that Theresa May did as Prime Minister is accept my resignation along with a few others. And so after 9 years, I left the government. And
At that point, Boris had been elected or was about to be.
yes, so
It was
yes,
obvious.
yeah.
Or
yeah.
had he actually been elected?
He had won the leadership of the.
He'd won the
leadership.
Okay.
He was going to become Prime Minister.
Yes.
So Theresa May did Prime Minister's questions, and then she went back to her office, and Boris was going to become Prime Minister that afternoon, and I resigned that lunchtime.
Yes.
And for the first time for a very long time became a backbencher.
And how did you feel about that?
Well, I knew it was coming. And look, I felt I had, in a way, I felt I had quite a good political death. So it was one of those where it was all prepared. I'd kind of had farewell parties. I knew it was coming. Most people become ex-ministers because they've been part of a team that's lost a general election, or it's happened at a reshuffle, and they're out on their ear, and that might be unexpected, or they're sort of caught up in some kind of scandal and have to resign. I was able to, sort of thank my private office and my team there.
Yes.
So
that was
farewell
all
drinks party, say goodbye to the department. It was kind of, it was
in a
rare,
pleasant way.
in a
without
pleasant
any
way. It was a
rancor.
rare,
But then,
rare
of course,
privilege.
you did then go on to seal your fate, as it were. Could you talk a bit about that? Why you made that decision to vote against the government?
So it comes back to the same point about a no-deal Brexit. And I think given that Boris Johnson had won on the basis he was going to leave without a deal, and given that I think that would have been catastrophic for the United Kingdom, and basically others had come up with a plan of a way in which that could be stopped. I found myself in sort of relatively prominent position as part of the rebels, the various ex-ministers who were there, essentially had the balance of power. There was talk of what was, I think Robert Peston coined the phrase, the Gawkwood Squad. And I really felt it was incumbent on me not to let the side down and to do what we could to stop a no-deal Brexit.
You don't regret it in any way?
No, I don't. No. And there was always, there was always a risk that was going to bring my career to an end. But honestly, in sort of terms of sacrifice and so on, I was hardly charging the Normandy beaches.
Well, of course, you did then go and stand as an independent at the next election, but of course that didn't work.
It didn't work. It was. I really enjoyed the campaign. Look, things move really quickly. I went from being a Conservative cabinet minister to no longer being a cabinet minister at the end of July to being no longer a Conservative MP at the beginning of September.
Quite.
And I was then an independent. Then there was a general election called. Of course, I couldn't stand as a Conservative in that context, having lost the whip. And I decided that I would run as an independent. It was a really, frankly, it was an enjoyable campaign. We got lots of terrific volunteers, ex-Conservatives, but Labour, Liberal Democrat, Green, people of no party whatsoever. And it was, I really enjoyed making the case, at least until the votes were cast. And then I came.
Well, that must have been upsetting.
I didn't think I was going to win. I was grateful to the nearly 16,000 people who voted for me. So it was a respectable showing. But in the end, that particular general election, it came down to, for most people, it came down to a binary choice as did you want Boris Johnson as Prime Minister or Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. A dreadful choice, I think, that was put to the British people. But that was how most people saw it, and therefore it was very difficult as an independent to
make any headway between that. Just finally on Boris Johnson, his attitude to the rule of law. What's your view about that?
Not impressed. So
that's putting it very mildly.
That is putting it mildly. So look, I think
it's putting it in a very lawyerly way, if I may say.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment, Francis. But look, the move on the sort of internal markets bill and the flouting of international law. I mean, essentially flouting a treaty that he
prorogation
just
of Parliament,
and yes, before that, the prorogation of Parliament, which was, I mean, him doing that was also, coming back to why did I rebel? Him doing, in September 2019, him doing that, I think, definitely strengthened my views on this, that we had to stop it, that this was completely unacceptable behaviour.
Of course, it's not held across the Conservative Party.
No, far from it.
By any manner of means.
No, far
even
from it.
One of your own colleagues, Robert Buckland, takes a different view about that.
Yes, Robert and I strongly disagree on those issues.
Are you still quite friendly?
Yeah, yes, I see Robert from time to time. Yeah, we're on good terms, but we have our disagreements over that particular.
So, do you feel? I mean, some people have said Boris Johnson was quite cavalier with the rule of law. He didn't really follow it, didn't apply it, didn't.
Well, if you're putting words into my mouth, I'm quite happy to use those words. Yes.
Oh, right. Well, that's fine. Yes,
he was absolutely completely cavalier. He had no concern over that, a complete lack of respect for our institutions, no recognition that there are constraints on political leaders, that is not just about raw power, or at least, if you do that, I just think you undermine what is special about this country. And the rule of law, the strength of our institutions, these are very conservative instincts by their own values. I mean, not by any means uniquely conservative, but I have.
But has that done damage that is irreparable?
I don't know about irreparable, but it certainly did a lot of damage to our reputation. I think the combination of Brexit and the way in which that was done. The extraordinary way it was done, that disregarded a lot of norms in terms of international behaviour. We're talking earlier in the context of what Donald Trump is doing now.
Sounds very similar, doesn't it?
Yeah, Trump takes this on to another level. To be fair, but I do think that the approach that Boris Johnson had was very damaging for us as a country. I think very damaging for the long-term reputation of the Conservative Party. I think it has, to some extent, debased our politics. And I have absolutely no regrets about doing what I could to try to stop that from happening, both in trying to stop Boris Johnson become leader of the party and stop him pursuing the Brexit that he wanted to. In that sense, I regret not being re-elected in 2019 and being able to continue that in Parliament, but so be it.
Do you see yourself being back in Parliament, particularly with the new Kemi Badenoch's regime?
I rejoined the Conservative Party
I saw you did.
in 2024, last year, in order to have a vote in the leadership election.
You see yourself back in government?
I would be very surprised, truth be told. I think the Conservative Party is still some way away from where I would want it to be. It appears to me to be more focused on appealing, on trying to emulate the Reform Party.
Well, it is trying to see off Nigel Farage.
It's trying to see off.
Do you think it can do that?
I'm not sure it can. I think, I hope it does. I don't want to see Reform as a strong force in our politics, but I would want to see the Conservative Party re-establishing itself as a mainstream party of the centre-right. Now, I know that this is a difficult time for mainstream parties of the centre-right, although Germany's just elected what will be a new government led by a mainstream centre-right figure. But I worry that the Conservative Party is too focused on appealing to populist voters, promising them things that I don't think can be delivered. And I think it needs to broaden its base to appeal to perhaps some younger, some better qualified, better educated voters, that I think it's got to win back the home counties, which was the heartlands of the Conservative Party, but which has now been captured by the Liberal Democrats. And I think it's got to look like a sensible, responsible party of government again. And I think it's a long way from doing that. And if that party were ever to re-emerge, would I potentially be interested in getting more involved again and running as a candidate? Perhaps, I don't know.
What about, do you find yourself at this very moment perhaps nearer Keir Starmer than Kemi Badenoch?
Look, I think Keir Starmer has, at the time we are speaking, I think has handled the issue of Ukraine with a great deal of skill. But look, my politics are essentially centre-right. So
we're not going to see you going off joining Labour or the Lib Dems?
I would be very surprised, I think, to find out. I'm more than happy to help the government on particular issues. I'm very privileged to be helping them on sentencing policies at the moment. I am with them in terms of wanting to sort of resist the emergence of populist politics of the right. But look, as I say, my instincts are centre-right. I'm sceptical about what governments can do. I do believe I'm fiscally conservative. I do believe we have to be competitive on certain taxes in particular. I believe in fundamentally in a market economy. All of these things are distinctly right of centre or centre-right. That's where my politics lie, but where I can find common cause with the government on, for example, sentencing policy, I'm more than happy to do that.
This podcast was brought to you by the University of Law. Subscribe now to make sure you don't miss the next episode.